So good afternoon everyone. Now, yesterday we were talking about the Marathas, right? And we discussed the Anglo-Maratha wars also. And that we had seen that how the internal differences between the Marathas themselves were a key reason responsible for these differences triggering a wider conflict, right? So this is something that we have talked about before itself. Now, so these are something that we have already talked about before. Now, we can just firstly write about this. You were writing the timeline, right? So, we complete the timeline. We have written till 1740. Right? Okay, till 1761, right? So we had written in the timeline till 1761, where we had said that during 4 decades of Peshwa rule, the Maratha influence expanded vastly, and constant Maratha raids forced even Bengal in 1751 to grant Chauth and the control of portions of Odisha region to Marathas. We had written till here. हाँ, जिसने नहीं देखा है वो बगल वाली कॉपी में देखिए होगा. Okay. So that is something that we broadly written till. Now we are writing after 1761. So you give in the same timeline 1775. The dispute in 1775, the dispute over the Peshwaship of Narayan Rao emerged in 1775 as Raghunath Rao staked a claim. Raghunath Rao staked a claim over Peshwaship. After assassinating Narayan Rao. This triggered a dispute within the Maratha Empire. This triggered a dispute within the Maratha Empire as the Maratha Sardars aimed to overthrow Raghunath Rao and thus the Holkars Scindias and Bhosle. Thus the Holkar, Scindia and Bhosle launched a combined military offensive against Raghunath Rao. Narayan Rao is killed by Raghunath Rao, and now against Raghunath Rao there is the combined military offensive by the Maratha Sardars. आप लिखिए सब आएगा धीमे धीमे है ना. So लिखिए आगे लिखिए. Right in the next para. In the same year, right in the next para. Okay. Following the attack, Raghunath Rao approached the British stationed in Salsette region. Following the attack, Raghunath Rao approached the British stationed in the Salsette region, seeking their support to subdue Maratha Sardars. Thus, the dispute over Peshwaship led to the outbreak of the First Anglo-Maratha War. The outbreak of the First Anglo-Maratha War. Okay. Then you mention in 1779. In 1779, under the leadership of Nana Fadnis, the Maratha Sardars imposed a crushing defeat on the British forces in the Battle of Vadgaon. In the Battle of Vadgaon. In the Battle of Vadgaon. Fadnis rose to prominence. And soon emerged as the major locus of power which kept a united Maratha front against British. In 1782, what is happening? The Treaty of Salabai. In 1782, the Anglo-French, the first Anglo-Maratha War ended with the Treaty of Salabai. Ended with the Treaty of Salabai. Ended with the Treaty of Salabai, in which or under which the British A, and you write subpoints A, B, C, D, under which the British A agreed to withdraw from the region the British agreed to withdraw from the region and not interfere further within succession disputes of Marathas. Within succession disputes of Marathas. B, the British returned all Maratha territories captured in the region. All Maratha territories captured in the region since 1775. Or since the outbreak of the war, one and the same thing. In return, the Marathas agreed to no, not C point. A and B is done, then you write, in return the Marathas agreed to A. So what the British agreed to and what the Marathas agreed to, that is what we are writing. First we wrote what the British agreed to, A and B. Now we are writing what the Marathas agreed to, A and B. Okay. In return the Marathas agreed to A, grant more trading privileges. Agreed to grant more trading privileges to the British in the region. Agreed to grant more trading privileges to the British in the region. And B, agreed to join hands with point B. Agreed to join hands with British in case of breakout of hostilities in case of breakout of hostilities with Mysore in the future. Right. Tipu Sultan 1779 no 9 हाँ हाँ 1799 हाँ 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 ब्रिटिश कहाँ कह रहे हैं? British and Marathas both are agreeing to join hands that if there is any breakout of conflict, the Marathas would side with the British. They are saying in 1782. Tipu Sultan is dying in 1799. Okay, so that is it. Now, the Treaty of Salabai thus. The Treaty of Salabai thus. Yeah, continue. A and B written, so bas, that's it. Now, just we are concluding this. The Treaty of Salabai thus brought interim peace. The Treaty of Salabai thus brought interim peace between the Marathas and British. Interim peace between the Marathas and British. And Fadnis and Nana Fadnis was a key architect. And Nana Fadnis was a key architect of this agreement. In 1802, now, or you can write in 1800 Nana Fadnis dies. And in 1802, as Bajirao II asserted control over, as Bajirao II asserted control over Peshwaship, as Bajirao II asserted control over Peshwaship, the Holkars were bitterly opposed. The Holkars were bitterly opposed to his rule. And thus attacked the Peshwa's territories in and around Pune or in and around Pune. Okay. Bajirao II, next paragraph within the same. Bajirao II approached the British which agreed to intervene, which agreed to approach the British, who agreed to intervene on his behalf. If the Peshwa signed the subsidiary alliance. If the Peshwa signed the subsidiary alliance. In 1802, with the Treaty of Bassein, pardon? In the same. In 1802, with the Treaty of Bassein, see, one of the things is about answer writing also. It is often important. आपको ज़रूरी नहीं है उसको 1, 2, 3, 4 लिख के ही कोई point को number करें. But as soon as a point is ending and you're beginning another point, then your answer should not be one big paragraph. At least it must be broken into small paragraphs. Okay, because it's easier for the examiner that way to go through your answer script. So that is the reason. That we are saying that basically if you are writing any answer, suppose you are writing causes, one major cause is ending, the other cause you are writing. You need not always mention point 1, 2, 3, 4. You can write one cause that is ended, differentiate it clearly from another cause. Don't put everything in one paragraph. कि political cause, economic, social सब आपने एक बड़े से paragraph में लिख दिया कहानी की तरह. Okay, it must be clearly differentiated. It eases the pain of the examiner. If you ease the pain of the examiner will also respond similarly, right? So the Treaty of Bassein was signed in 1802. It is the Treaty of Bassein with which you see the whole subsidiary alliance system is coming into place between the Peshwas and the British. Then you give the next heading is 1803. 1803 to 1805. The period. Okay, with the Treaty of Bassein, I thought we had completed. With the Treaty of Bassein, the Peshwa entered into a subsidiary alliance with the British, and this triggered the outbreak of Second Anglo-Maratha War. This triggered the outbreak of the Second Anglo-Maratha War from 1803 to 1805. From 1803 to 1805. Okay. The Holkars in 1803 to 1805, you write, the Holkars were subdued by the British. The Holkars were subdued by the British. And the Peshwaship of Bajirao II was reasserted. Okay, by 1805. Now what is happening after this? After this, you see that, give the next para under the heading 1805 to 1817. just a second, let's just complete the period saw the 1805 to 1817 period. The 1805 to 1817 period saw a decline in the authority of the Peshwa, a decline in the authority of the Peshwa, and an increasing indirect influence of the British in the region. Then you give the heading 1817 to 1819. 1817 to 1819. This period 1817 to 1819, this period saw the final desperate attempt by Maratha Sardars under the leadership of Bajirao II, by Maratha Sardars under the leadership of Bajirao II, by Maratha Sardars under the leadership of Bajirao II, by the Maratha Sardars under the leadership of Bajirao II, to reassert their authority and push out the British presence from the region. And push out the British presence from the region. However, the Third Anglo-Maratha War saw the British impose a decisive defeat on the Marathas and the Peshwaship was abolished. And the Peshwaship was abolished. Now, was there any treaty? No. अभी अब कोई treaty नहीं, अब हो गया. Okay. Now, write the significance of the Anglo-Maratha wars. So, in these events itself, the causes are visible, right? I told you yesterday that if a question comes like this, that the Anglo-Maratha wars were a result of the internal differences amongst the Maratha Empire or amongst the Maratha rulers, discuss. Then you point out that how internal disputes over Peshwaship were clearly the reason for the first and the second war, and how the third war was a final yet a final and desperate but yet an attempt to drive out the British, who had anyways increased their influence in the region by building upon, by increasing their influence by building upon the differences, by building upon or utilizing the differences between the Maratha Sardars, and how the last war was a final yet not a sufficient attempt to overthrow the British from the region, right? That is there. So you can write about the significance of the Anglo-Maratha wars. The significance of the Anglo-Maratha wars. Yeah. So I'm saying that if they give you a question like this, this is how you approach it. Yeah. That we have discussed the causes in all these wars. Actually, in the timeline, we have written the cause also of exactly what is triggering every war, right? So you can use to write a answer. Now you can write about the significance of Anglo-Maratha wars first. The Anglo-Maratha wars brought down the curtains, for Maratha rule and ended the last formidable challenge to British in the region. And ended the last formidable challenge to the British in the region. This triggered a major shift. In the British policy towards princely states, which now were threatened by the adoption of principle of paramountancy. The principle of paramount. The word paramount means supreme, right? The principle of paramountancy unleashed by the British and threatened annexation in cases or threatened annexation in case of an adverse impact and threatened annexation in case of an adverse impact on British economic interests. In the region. And threatened What did we dictate? And threatened a
annexation in case of any adverse impact on British economic interests in the
हाँ सही है, कोई भी आँच आई तो चीर देंगे. Okay, so जो मांगोगे खीर देंगे and all that, right? So Indians have too high jingoism, right? We like talk in hyperbole, right? ये कर देंगे वो कर देंगे, करना कुछ नहीं है. So there is one thing that I've always suggested: India should introduce military conscription. This is an ethical question also. That see, we anyways have a huge population, and we always say population is coming as a roadblock to vikas, right? So population becomes the obstacle to any development, and we have population which has too much nationalism, and we should include military conscription, mandatory 2-year service in the army. What do you think? Very nice. Israel has, right? We should also do the same thing. What will happen is that next time you will not say, go to Siachen, because you yourself will be in Siachen. And then, if you survive a frostbite, not the bullet, because more soldiers have died in Siachen to frostbite than to bullets. So if you survive frostbite, you will come and go to IIT. Otherwise, you would have laid your life in the cause of the nation. Anyways, there is so much death and glory, right? So all those who have this unaddressed desire of teaching a lesson to the opponent, they will also get a chance. India will get to use its demographic dividend, at least to put it to some use, right? And Pakistan would be threatened that India can always आ जाएंगे वो तो बहुत सारे, right? So I personally think it's a good idea, and obviously. And then Arnab Goswami will also go for 2 years. No? If he comes back, then well and good. So, chaliye. Now the next issue that we are talking about, today is another very important topic. देखिए खत्म हो गया अभी है. Painful period is खत्म. अब यहाँ से सब बहुत easy है. Okay, and that is about, for example, the first thing that we are talking today is the economic impact of British rule. It's a very important topic. Prelims और mains सब में बहुत questions आते हैं from this topic, and it will take some time for us to do this, but it's a pretty important topic. Prelims and mains, everywhere they have asked questions. Okay, and don't worry, I'll take one of those classes in which I'll discuss previous year questions and how do you approach them in the class. Okay, prelims का भी mains का भी, तो वो हम करेंगे, लेकिन पहले हम पढ़ें. आपको क्या होता है, सी इट्स अ वेरी नेचुरल एंजाइटी, वी ऑफन फील एंशियस कि सर हाउ विल वी राइट आंसर्स, हाउ विल वी राइट आंसर्स. वंस यू हैव रेड एंड यू हैव रिवाइज्ड ट्वाइस और थ्राइस, ओनली देन आई कैन एक्सप्लेन यू. एंड वन ऑफ द बेस्ट थिंग इज आप हाउ मत जाइए, आप लिखिए. लिखने के बाद आप हमारे पास ले आइए, है ना. यू विल गेट इट चेक्ड हियर एनीवेज एंड यू कैन ब्रिंग देम टू अस एंड वी कैन टेल यू कि दिस इज हाउ यू कुड हैव डन इट. बट राइटिंग शुड नॉट हैपन विदाउट 2 or 3 रिविजन्स आइडियली. Because you will not, even if you knew the answer, you will only come back with saying, sir, मैं नहीं लिख पा रहा, क्योंकि आपके points ही दिमाग में, they are not crystallized. When points are crystallized, you will be able to write better. So first 2 or 3 revisions, then you start writing, and slowly you will start improving. Okay, that goes for every subject. Now let's be talking about the economic impact of British rule. What are the topics which are important here? What are the topics which are important here in the economic impact of British rule? Why are we, अब आप बोलेंगे कि sir, why are we all of a sudden talking about economic impact? What about law, army, police under British administrative? वो हम करेंगे सर बाद में, पहले ये, because there is a topic which is important both from prelims and mains point of view. Now in economic impact we'll talk about, see, they can give you questions both in prelims and mains. In the mains, for example, they can ask you an economic impact of a particular British policy. They will not ask you to discuss the economic impact of British rule in India, but a specific question will come. For example, discuss the economic impact of the British trade policies on the Indian economy. Discuss the economic impact of the British land revenue policies on agrarian India. Or they will ask you a question, discuss the impact of the construction of railways on the Indian economy. Or they can ask you, discuss the impact of foreign investments on Indian economy. So these are not same question, ये सब अलग अलग questions है on specific aspects. Okay, they can ask you. Now in the mains examination, they'll ask you discuss the impact of land revenue policies. In the prelims, for example, they've asked questions before also and they'll ask again also. That, for example, discuss the different type, that in the prelims they'll give that with respect to the Rayatwari settlement system, which of the following statements are true. Revenue settlement system in British India were of three broad types, right? Rayatwari, Mahalwari and the permanent settlement. Rayatwari, Mahalwari and the permanent settlement. तो आप उस पे पेन मत लीजिए, वो मैं बताऊंगा आगे. But they will ask you more factual questions there. In the mains, they will ask you more of impact. Okay. Similarly, the same things about trade policies, etc. is also there, and it will become clear when we'll discuss. So these are the 4 or 5 major important themes that you have to focus upon in this topic. We'll start one by one. Okay. Let's first discuss the trade policies. देखिए ये पहले तो इकोनॉमिक इम्पैक्ट है, तो आइडियली तो आपको इकोनॉमिक्स की थोड़ा नॉलेज होना चाहिए, बट विल डिस्कस व्हाटएवर बेसिक स्टफ इज रिक्वायर्ड टू अंडरस्टैंड दिस, विल डिस्कस. सो लेट्स फर्स्ट डिस्कस व्हाट द ट्रेड पॉलिसी एंड देयर इम्पैक्ट. ओके, एंड दिस इज अ प्रीटी इंपॉर्टेंट टॉपिक, द ट्रेड पॉलिसी इटसेल्फ. ओके, नाउ देखिए, फर्स्ट अंडरस्टैंड देन आई विल डिक्टेट. That to understand this, what is happening with the trade policy, one has to understand that we divide. They can ask you a question like this also. Discuss the evolution of British trade policies with respect to India over the 18th and 19th century and its impact. So evolution and impact, both the things we must know. So firstly we say that the British trade policy in India from 1600s to 1750 was one. Then it underwent a major shift after 1750s. It started undergoing a shift slowly after 1750s and underwent a major shift which starts becoming visible in the few decades after 1750s. And this is even more acutely visible in the beginning of the 19th century. Okay, so you see that slowly shift starts happening from 1750s, and every shift is not sudden. इकोनॉमी में ऐसा नहीं होता कि एक दिन आप एग्रीकल्चरल हैं, अगले दिन इंडस्ट्रियल हो गए. एक दिन इंडस्ट्रियल रेवोल्यूशन नहीं है, अगले दिन इंडस्ट्रियल रेवोल्यूशन हो गया. Okay, it's all something that happens over a period of time. But the shift started happening from 1750s onward. So there was a policy before 1750, British trade policy, and there was a trade policy after 1750. And 1750s became a 1750s, it's a whole decade which became slowly a turning point in British trade policies. So what was the policies before 1750s and what were the policies after 1750s? पर पहली बात, what changed in 1750s? Right? What changed in 1750s? The Anglo-Carnatic Wars, or to be more precise, in 1750s, one thing that is happening is whether in Plassey, whether in Buxar, or whether in the Carnatic region, the British are increasing their influence. The British are increasing their indirect influence in the region. But there is something else also happening in 1750s. Subsidiary alliance में तो बहुत टाइम है अभी. अहमद शाह अब्दाली, okay. Diwani rights. Revolution in French Revolution at 1789. Industrial Revolution. The other major change जिसका economics में impact होगा, that is about the industrial revolution. And so you see that in 1750s, two things are happening. The increasing British influence in the region and the industrial revolution. The increasing British influence in the region and industrial revolution. These things are, both are happening in 1750s, and they had a major impact on the trading policy. But let's first understand what is the policy before 1750s, then we'll see what change these things produce and what is the change. Okay. So let's first understand what is the policy from 1600 to 1750. देखिए, ये बिल्कुल भी difficult नहीं है समझना. That from 1600s to 1750s, what is happening is that the European traders are coming to the Indian princely rulers demanding trading rights, and with this they are buying goods from Indian traders. Remember Jagat Seth, all of these things, right? So the Indian traders are selling the goods to the European traders, and the Indian goods had a huge demand in Europe, predominantly, for example, in commodities like silk, for example, in commodities like spices and textiles. And I told you that India was the biggest textile producer in the world, or the producer of the finished textile goods. We were the world's biggest producer of finished textile goods because of 2 or 3 reasons. One, we had good quality cotton available, raw material locally. We had we had a good quality, not just cotton, but a good quality and a cheap labor force available, and local expertise to make good quality cloth. So basically, cheap labor, cheap raw material and adequate skills. The flourishing handicraft industry, the handloom industry in India basically made sure that we had finished textile goods available in India at a very cheap cost. They were so cheap and good in quality that the European traders the Indian producers would produce these goods, they would be bought by the Indian traders. Then the Indian traders would sell it to the European traders, and the European traders would sell it in the European market. And everybody made profits. We discussed this before also. That if Indian producer was selling a good at 5 rupees a piece to the trader was selling it at 7 rupees to the European trader was selling it at 10 rupees in the market. Even at such a price, the Indian good was cheaper and better in quality than the European producers. Because in Europe there was neither good quality raw material available. Cotton requires black soil, less rainfall, more sunlight. वहाँ कुछ नहीं है था. Right? हमारे जीवन की problem है हमारा ज़्यादा sunlight, right? Especially in cities like Delhi. Right? So, but वहाँ है नहीं. Right? So they did not have good quality raw material. Neither did they have the demographic dividend, surplus labor, which was skilled and at cheap cost. So neither they had cheap cost labor nor good quality and cheap raw material. So Indian goods were cheaper and more in demand, and thus everybody gained. The balance of trade, now this is the term, that the balance of trade was in India's favor. Balance of trade basically means a net. So if whatever are total exports from India minus total imports, that is what is the balance of trade. Indian traders were exporting much more than India was importing from the British. And so the balance of trade was in whose favor? The Indian traders. So the Indian traders were exporting more than they were importing, and trade would happen in gold or bullion. Right? International trade would be done in gold. Right? And so there was a net influx of gold into India. The economic trading relationship was beneficial to both the British and the Indian traders. It was also beneficial for the Indian producer because he is getting the access to the European market. It is a win-win relationship for all. However, the balance of trade is usually in India's favor, and the British have to pay the Indian traders in gold. They don't have any other good alternative good to offer to India, which could have been in huge demand in India. So the balance of trade is in India's favor. They have to bring in gold to buy Indian goods. That is there before 1750s. But it starts to change after 1750s. What is the change that happens after 1750s? Is the increasing British influence and industrial revolution. And this is what basically changes a lot of things. Firstly, with industrial revolution, the cost of production, industrial revolution brought what? Mass, machine-based production or mechanized mass production. A mechanized mass production, machines would decrease the requirement for labor, and if it would decrease the requirement for labor, then the labor cost will come down. That will also decrease the cost of production. So industrial revolution was decreasing the cost of production 1750s onwards, and the first area, the first economic segment which underwent the industrial revolution was the textile sector. Okay, and you have the spinning wheel, the spinning jenny, the power loom, all of these were invented. Indians used the hand loom, they started using the power loom. Power loom was powered by electricity, and electric powered power looms could produce textile goods at a much higher pace than hand looms could produce. So it's like you are working with hand looms, they're working with power looms, so they're producing much faster or a larger quantity of goods, and that too with less labor, so which are cheaper. That's one thing that starts. But as I told you, no revolution happens suddenly. No industrial revolution or no economic change has happened overnight. Revolutions may happen suddenly, but economic changes do not happen overnight. So it's not that one fine day in 1750, 51, 52, 53, all of a sudden there is a dramatic shift in the textile sector. It is slow and gradual over decades from 1750s onwards. The second change is what I told you, Plassey, Buxar, etc. 1750s and 60s, there's another change happening, that the political influence of the British is increasing. And now you see, especially after Plassey and Buxar, the British are doing what? Using the revenue generated from Bengal. To do what? To buy goods. So firstly, what is happening is that the East India Company is a trading company. Now it anyways has trading monopoly in the region. Now it does not also have to depend upon bringing in gold from outside. Rather, the land revenue generated from Bengal was used to purchase goods from the Indian traders. So with the land revenue itself, they could purchase the goods from the Indian traders or Indian producers directly. Either producer, trader, जो भी जिससे भी लेना चाहें, they could buy the goods by not paying, no need to pay them in bullion. The revenue generated from Bengal was used to further finance their trading activities in the region, meaning that they do not have to bring gold from outside. When gold was coming from outside, India was becoming sone ki chidiya. When gold stops coming, then it is no longer becoming a bigger sone ki chidiya. Okay, so the influx of gold started declining slowly after 1750s and 60s. That is one change which is happening. However, there is a change, we say, in both what? In both the nature of trade, there is a change in the nature of trade after 1750s and 60s, both quantitatively and qualitatively. अब ये क्या बोल रहा हूँ मैं? What is the change and how does it, what is the change in terms of quantity and quality, both things? That one of the things that happens is that देखिए बड़ी simple सी चीज़ है जीवन में समझने के लिए, that when industrial revolution is happening, it is producing goods in mass amounts, but mass production requires firstly mass market. You don't start producing goods without availability of a market, because you say, okay, I have power loom, I can produce 1,000 tons of textile goods, but there must be a demand for that much. If you produce 1000 tons but demand is only for 100 tons, then you will make loss. So it is not enough to have a mass production capacity, it is also necessary to have what? A mass market. Mass production requires a mass market. And so, as the British anyway had the trading monopoly in the region, they are now looking to capture the Indian market. Okay. And I'll explain this point in a bit more detail. They're looking to capture the Indian market. Who is looking to capture? Not the traders, traders also, but also capitalist class. अभी मैं थोड़ा बताऊंगा इसको थोड़ा सा. So there is a clear industrial revolution requires mass market. India has again demographic dividend. कपड़ा तो आदमी पहनेगा ही. iPhone भले ही ना खरीदे, लेकिन कपड़ा तो पहनेगा. And 17% of the world's population is there. So India obviously is one of the biggest textile market. Right. So in that context, you see that it was a major potential market for the textile sector. Okay. Now, and we'll talk about this. Now, what happens is that 1750s, I am saying 1750s and 60s, you see, to understand this, it's a slow change. Firstly, what happens is that there is Britain, there is continental Europe, and there is South Asia. Okay. And what is happening is this, that what is happening is that before 1757, as I just told you, that before 1757, Indian goods were brought by the East India Company and then sold into either continental European market or even in Britain. Now, so basically the East India Company became one of the mechanisms through which Indian producers were capturing the European market. But now there is in Britain the coming up of the textile producers, and this is the British capitalist class which is emerging. Okay, and this includes the Lancashire lobby. All the initial textile companies which were emerging in Britain with the scientific advances of power loom, flying shuttle, etc., they were setting up their industrial base in Lancashire. And they were the Lancashire group of textile producers. Now, these Lancashire group of textile producers were the ones who were first introducing these technologies of mass production. Okay. Now, they soon realized that if we are going to have mass production, we require a mass market. And firstly, they said, Ki, you have to clamp down on this. On whom? If the British producers or the Lancashire producers want to capture the continental European market, or immediately first as a first priority to capture the British market itself, they will have to compete with whom? Indian goods. And the problem is that Indian goods are cheap. So the Lancashire lobby's goods must be cheaper, but this was easier said than done. Because when you introduce a new technology, all of a sudden it does not produce a result. देखिए कोई भी होता है, एक telecom phone भी आता था, mobile phone 20 years ago was expensive. Today it's available. कुछ और हो ना हो देश में, mobile सबके हाथ में, right? So the cost of new technology is initially very high, and often it takes time for it to be adopted. So initially, as industrial revolution started in the textile sector, it all of a sudden did not decrease the cost of production. As new technologies were being adopted, the cost of production in Britain actually remained high. So much so that in Britain, if the Lancashire producers' goods or Lancashire goods costed 10 rupees a piece, then Indian goods, even after including all profit margins, cost, transport, etc., only costed 8 rupees. It's like what? It's like Chinese goods for India today. Okay. So basically what is happening is that Indian goods were flooding. The Indian goods had captured the European market in the textile sector, were known for their quality and their cost effectiveness, and thus they were the ones who had captured the British market. But unless and until the British producers had the access to the British market itself, whom would they produce for? So they were facing an intense competition from the Indian producers. So they said what? Firstly, take care of this competition. To take care of this competition, the British producers appealed to the British Parliament. That Parliament, listen, your task is to protect the interests of British producers. And you must protect the interests of British producers. Parliament asked, how can we do so for you? The Parliament was told that please impose what? Please impose high custom duties. So if you impose a custom duty of 40%, then this 8 rupee good will already become 11 or 12 rupee good. Right. So it will become 11 or 12 rupee good, and this is what will do, that it will protect the British market for British producer. Indian goods will have to pay a custom duty. देखिए बड़ा simple. हमारे देश में one of the reasons why you still have to look up to a Maruti is because Audi cannot be sold without 0% import tariff. Right. आप सबके पास Audi होती. German or European cars have to face an import duty of 40 to 100%. Okay, if you decrease and remove it, then Audi will become 40% cheaper. Audi will become the new Maruti, right? So, here Audi will, basically everybody can afford it, but India does this to provide a protection to the Indian automobile sector, automobile producers. So, for example, Trump keeps saying that India is imposing high import duties on Harley Davidson motorcycles. Right? तो हर किसी के पास होगी, आप बुलेट पे नहीं रोकेंगे. Right? So that is there. So one of the things is that here the British Parliament is dealing with what? The British Parliament is facing an appeal from the British producers of the Lancashire producers to impose custom duties. And it is not an appeal, it is called lobbying. Okay? And obviously, and the British producers actually bribed the British parliamentarians to increase custom duties. The British parliamentarians said, okay, we'll increase custom duties, but it is adversely impacting whom? It is adversely impacting not just Indian producers, but it is adversely impacting British East India Company. Indians का तो हो ही हो रहा है, लेकिन British East India Company is not happy with this decision. The East India Company is a private trading company. The British producers are also private producers. It is the interest of the British trading class in coming in conflict with the British industrial class. Okay, so this is a period of transition. Now, how does this get addressed? Is that this story goes further. What happens is that the Parliament goes in favor of the British producer and not the East India Company. In the favor of Lancashire producers and not the East India Company. Okay. Now the Lancashire producers have captured the British market as Indian goods had to face a tariff wall. Okay. But now the Lancashire producers, capitalism says ye dil mange more. We want a bigger market. देखिए capitalism की ये दास्तान है. Capitalism requires one thing, and that is free market. Okay, capitalism requires one thing: private owners of industries and a capitalist system based on private ownership of industries. कि जीवन में एक ही तमन्ना है, free market. And कोई और free हो ना हो, market must be free, so that goods can move freely. When you say free market, meaning no other country, no other side must import tariff barriers or other kind of barriers. जैसे हमने अपने आम बेचने यूरोप में, India wants to sell Alfonso mangoes in Europe. European says your mangoes are not safe, because of health issues. So they say that this is the issue and so we will not allow. So that is not a tariff barrier. Tariff is custom. That is not a custom barrier, that is a non-tariff barrier. Okay. So Indian said, फालतू बातें मत करिए, हम तो खा रहे हैं, हमें कुछ नहीं हुआ, आप भी खाओ, right? So Indian say कि don't erect non-tariff barriers. Okay, ये सारी terms आप newspaper में पढ़ेंगे. तब जब हम history पढ़ रहे हैं तो अगर economics की बात कर रहे हैं तो थोड़ा सा जो मैं examples दे रहा हूँ, all these are there in news. Okay, so that is there. Now all of this keeps happening. At this point of time, what is being said by the British is now we need to capture the Indian market. Why? Because the vast market for textile goods. Okay, it is a vast market for textile goods. So it is in this context the Lancashire producers are producing a good at 10 rupees, say, but Indian producers are producing a good at 6 rupees. वो तो cost was लगा के सब transport etc. Indian producers producing at 6 rupees. British producers are producing at 10 rupees. Initially their cost of production was say 12 rupees. Now slowly it has come down to 10 rupees. It all slowly their cost of production had also started decreasing. But still, even then, it was higher than that of Indian producers. So capturing the Indian market was very difficult. Now, if India would have had an independent government, India would have said, if you will impose a tariff barrier on us, we will also impose a tariff barrier on your goods. If Indian goods have to face 40% tariff in Britain, then India would also impose a 40% tariff on British goods being sold in India. China or US may, right? This is what you're seeing, right? That we will impose, that is what is there. But that is firstly not possible here. So वो तो आप भूल ही जाइए that India can protect the Indian market from British exports by imposing a tariff wall. Why? Because the British are already increasing their influence in the region, getting trading monopoly. On top of that, आप बोलें कि नहीं हम trade नहीं करने देंगे, तो this is not going to happen, right? So there is no question of that happening, of Indian states retaliating against the British by imposing tariff barriers. That's not possible. Secondly, but the problem is that this goods in India, the monopoly of doing trade in India belong to the East India Company, and we'll talk about Charter Acts, all these things, etc. East India Company is getting has the monopoly to do trade, but उसके लिए problem है कि it is buying at 10 rupees, and if it has to sell in Indian market you have to sell at 6 rupees or less, right? Otherwise Indians won't buy. It has to be at the same price or cheaper. So what did the East India Company have to do? The East India Company from 1760s to 1780s, it did not make them economic sense for them to buy more expensive and sell at a loss. But if this is going to continue, then they will never be able to capture the Lancashire producer will never be able to capture the Indian market. So Lancashire producer again appealed to the British Parliament that you tell the East India Company to buy British goods and sell them in the Indian market. So the British producers were now got a law passed by the British Parliament under which every year goods worth rupees roughly around 3 lakh pounds of a monetary value of roughly around 3 lakh pounds were to be brought by the East India Company from the Lancashire producers and then be sold in Indian market. But why? Why should East India Company do so? That is why East India Company is not willing to do so. That is why they got a law passed by the British Parliament. And basically this was a condition. If the East India Company wanted the military support of the British Army, then it required to obey the law, and this is now the law, right? So this is the British law, and they obviously, this is a clear act of lobbying, but there is a problem. The East India Company is going to make a loss, and yes, for 2 decades the East India Company was buying at 10 rupees and selling at 6 rupees, meaning it is doing trade but it is making loss. So this is the geo model of trade. देखिए that अभी चल रहा है लॉस, आएगा एक दिन प्रॉफिट, कैसे? So basically as they slowly started, so now in India or in South Asia at this point of time, if the local producers were producing at 6 rupees a piece, the East India Company sold at 5 rupees a piece. This is what is called as predatory pricing or dumping of goods below the cost of production. So deliberately, in full well knowing that they are making a loss, they were anyways under pressure and they started selling goods at a cost lower than the cost of Indian goods for achieving two things. Firstly, it would slowly drive out the small Indian producer. Slowly, small Indian producers will start losing out on the Indian market to the British goods. Right? The slowly will start losing out on the Indian market to the British goods, and this is a problem. Why? Because slowly and slowly Indian producers will be wiped out from the Indian market. They will not be able to compete with the cheaply produced or the cheaply sold British goods, even though they may be, even their cost of production may have been higher, but they will start making losses and they will be driven out of the Indian market. Now it will give the monopoly to whom? The British East India Company. So the British India Company, when the competition of 6 rupees will end, it can always increase it to 7 rupees. That is possible. If you have monopoly of the market, you can always dictate the prices. देखिए अगर आप ही अकेले हैं which supplies a commodity, then you are the sole supplier, you can always dictate the prices in the market. But also there was the other possibility, and this is also what was going on simultaneously, that they did slightly increase the cost of goods after 1780s, but even the selling price of goods partly after 1760s, a selling price of goods was also increased after 1780s, but the cost of production is coming down over decades, right? Slowly and slowly every new technology gets more efficient and it starts decreasing the cost of production. So on the one side the cost of production slowly started decreasing. So now the goods were no longer being sold at 10 rupees to the East India Company. The price started coming down, 8 rupees, 7 rupees, etc. because new technologies and new technologies and mass production slowly brought down the cost of labor in Britain. And anyways the competition from Indian producers is being wiped out. And so slowly the time will come when Jio will make profits. Right? When the Jio started selling telecom, under the 4G auctioning data at cheap prices, it forced the merger of Idea and Vodafone. Okay? क्योंकि अकेले Idea था वैसे भी कुछ नहीं हो पा रहा था, and after Jio तो बिल्कुल भी नहीं हो पा रहा था. Right? So Idea started making losses. Vodafone and Idea merged together. Okay? So you often see smaller players try to actually join hands to try and compete with the bigger players. Now but if this is not checked, then there can always be a monopolization in the market. उसको रोकने के लिए भी समाधान है. You have Competition Commission of India, many other things are there today to deny a monopoly of the market to any one player, because monopoly can always result in price distortions. आप पढ़ेंगे economy में. Just to give you that context. So what is happening now? With industrial revolution, with Indian market being flooded with British goods, the balance of trade is now shifting in whose favor? British. So bullion is now, or gold is now going out of India. So now सोने की चिड़िया is no longer remaining चिड़िया or सोना, whatever, right? Basically gold started moving out of India. There is a qualitative shift. There is a quantitative shift in the balance of trade. From being a exporter of goods, we are predominantly becoming a market for goods. Okay? And also we were historically the exporter of finished goods, right? But after industrial revolution, India is becoming a market for finished goods and becomes a supplier only of रॉ मटेरियल्स, राइट. जैसे अभी चाइना के साथ होता है, वी गिव चाइना को आयरन, चाइना मेक्स प्रोसेस स्टील एंड देन सेल्स इट इन द वर्ल्ड इंक्लूडिंग इन इंडिया, राइट. In fact, China produces half of the total steel produced in the world. Okay, so that is why and India also imports high grade finished steel from China. So in that context, you see, this is the qualitative shift. एक तो quantity का shift है, that from being a supplier, from being the chief exporter, India is becoming a chief importer. And that is the shift in quantity. But the qualitative shift is from being a supplier of finished goods, we are becoming a supplier mainly of raw materials. So that is why Karl Marx said that industrial revolution has produced one of the most unimaginable consequences by converting a country, converting the mother of cotton, that is India, historically converting the mother of cotton, that is India, from being a vast producer of goods to becoming a vast market for cotton goods. And this could not have happened without two things: industrial revolution and the British colonial or the British imperial presence in the region. देखिए ये हो ही नहीं सकता only on industrial revolution basis. Merely technology did not change anything, because you have to have a policy which supports adoption of certain technology. If India would have been an independent country and British would have denied the European British market to Indian goods, India would have denied the Indian market to the British goods. So it is not just because of industrial revolution that there is a shift, qualitative and quantitative. It is also because of imperial or colonial, or the increasing influence of British in the region, political as well as economic. Is that clear? So this is the shift in the nature of trade. This is the shift in the nature of trade that we are talking about. Clear? Any doubts in this? So you can firstly write down about this itself. And this is what we say, what is the impact of this? It produces 2 or 3 impacts, bade chote chote. It leads to deindustrialization in India. Industrial revolution of Britain was leading to deindustrialization in India. Why? Because our producers are losing out on our market itself, right? And that is why we say that the industrial revolution in Britain led to deindustrialization in India. 2 major economic activities in India were either agriculture or handicrafts or handlooms. And these handlooms are suffering a major setback. So unemployment is going to increase or decrease? Increase, right? So unemployment increased, deindustrialization happened, and India became a supplier of raw materials from historically being a supplier of finished goods. Ek last point or. One of the things also is that you should know there is a theory of comparative. चलिए छोड़िए वो सब. अभी बस आप इतना याद रखिए कि in a value chain of a product, suppose there is cotton, then it is converted into yarn or cotton yarn, and then basically converted into the final shirt, yeah, right, fabric, then final product, right? And that is how you see there's a value chain from raw material to the end finished product. Now economic theories have consistently pointed out the fact that often in this value chain, the more up you are in the value chain, the major share of profit will go to you. Okay? For example, just to give you a context, for every Barbie doll which is made by a US company and sold in the world over, it is manufactured in China. But China gets only 17 cents of every dollar for manufacturing the doll. A larger part of the profit goes to the marketing, R&D, all of these things. This is a current example. But here also you see that the finished goods, those who made the finished goods got the largest amount of profits. Those who supplied the raw materials only got a very small amount of the final cost of the good. Okay. So not just Indians were supplying raw materials, the economic gains of these activities were largely cornered by whom? British. क्योंकि आप बोलेंगे कि सर एग्रीकल्चर को तो इंडियन एग्रीकल्चर इज एटलीस्ट गेटिंग अ मार्केट, रॉ कॉटन को कोई जगह तो मिल रही है जाने के लिए. देखिए ऐसा है कि हमेशा देयर विल बी सम अमाउंट ऑफ इंपोर्ट एंड एक्सपोर्ट. इट इज ऑल्सो इंपॉर्टेंट टू नो दैट आर यू एक्सपोर्टिंग, not just what amount of volume are you exporting, but what is the nature of that export. Is it raw material or is it finished goods? हम ये पूछते ही क्यों हैं? क्योंकि a finished good will have a much higher market value than a raw material. Right? That is there. So please write down first. Economic impact of British rule. Economic impact of British rule is the heading of the new chapter. Within that, you first give the subheading that the evolution of British trade policies, evolution of British trade policies and their impact. Evolution of British trade policies and their impact. The evolution of British East India the evolution of British East India companies trade policies just write down the word evolution. The evolution of British East India Company's trade policies were written, right? Just write down the word evolution. The British East India Company's trade policies, evolution ko you strike down, okay? The British East India Company's trade policies underwent a quantitative and qualitative shift over the 18th century, particularly after 1750s. Particularly after 1750s, as two major events were witnessed during this period. A. The advent of industrial revolution. The advent of industrial revolution in Britain the advent of the industrial revolution in Britain, firstly in the textile sector, and second, the increasing British political and economic influence The increasing British political and economic influence in South Asia, particularly in Bengal, Hyderabad, etc. Next para. The major shift or the major shift the major shift or sorry the major trade policy from 1600s, the major trade policy from 1600 to 1750s, the major trade policies from 1600 trade policy from 1600s to 1750s relied upon the East India Company purchasing finished goods from Indian handloom producers and traders which had a huge demand in Europe, given their superior quality and low cost. Thus, the balance of trade during this period was hugely in favor of the Indian producers or in favor of the Indian traders and resulted in a net influx of bullion. Bullion is the term which is used for gold. Okay. Now, post 1750s, a one-sided free trade regime free trade, muft. One-sided free trade regime. See, what do we mean by free trade? Meaning that there are no tariff or non-tariff barriers. Now, there are no tariff or non-tariff barriers, but the problem is what? That we are saying one-sided free trade. Why? Because Indian goods are facing tariff barriers, but British goods are not facing any tariff barriers. So post 1750 saw the imposition of one-sided free trade regime. Post 1750, the one-sided free trade regime was imposed on India as the East India Company along with the Lancashire textile producers as the East India Company along with the Lancashire textile producers flooded the Indian market with British goods. Just a second, I'll give you time. Is this much clear? Let's just completely write down and then I'll give you time to ask question. With next para. With these changes, a qualitative shift was witnessed. With these changes, a qualitative shift was witnessed, and India was reduced to a status of supplier of a raw material. India was reduced to the status of supplier of a raw material and became a vast market for finished British goods. Vast market. India was reduced to the status of supplier of raw materials and became a vast market for British finished goods. So we have written about the quantitative also. What is the quantitative one? That is one-sided free trade. The balance of trade is with one-sided free trade, the balance of trade is shifting in whose favor? The British East India companies, right? So that is the quantitative shift. Quantitative shift में balance of trade की बात होती है. Qualitative shift में nature of trade की बात होती है. Finished goods और raw material. Both of them are changing. Is that point clear? Everybody? So any other doubts still here? Any other doubts still here? Just add one more line. The quantitative shift had also, the quantitative shift was also witnessed. The quantitative shift was also witnessed as the balance of trade shifted in favor of, as the balance of trade shifted in favor of the British. Now, the next thing that we are talking about is write down impact. ये तो हमने चीज डिस्कस किया. What is the evolution and what is the impact? The impact is, you write down that impact, the changing nature of the British trade policy towards India, the changing nature of the British trade policy towards India brought about deindustrialization, of the Indian economy, brought about the deindustrialization of the Indian economy and triggered a collapse of the handloom industries. It triggered a collapse of the handloom industries, leading to the worsening of the unemployment problem in the region. Clear? Leading to the worsening of the unemployment problem in the region. Clear? अभी ट्रेड पॉलिसी का इम्पैक्ट इतना ही है. सबका इम्पैक्ट होते होते बहुत सारे इम्पैक्ट देखने मिलेंगे आपको. ओके, सो दैट इज दैट. नाउ द नेक्स्ट थिंग that we are talking about is what? Is not just the trade policy but the land revenue policy. अब land revenue policy में दो तीन चीजें हैं जो आपसे और पूछी जा सकती हैं मेंस में. ओके, that see, the first question, they can give you a question like this also in the mains examination, that comparative question ऐसा आ सकता है, that British had a land revenue policy, so had the pre-British counterparts. Mughals, Marathas, Mysore all had a land revenue policy, land revenue collection policy. They can ask you a question like this, that to what extent the British land revenue policies differed from their pre-British counterparts, or discuss the nature of British land revenue policies and to what extent they differed from the pre-British counterparts. अब ऐसा अगर क्वेश्चन आता है तो बच्चे क्या हो जाते हैं, चालू करना कि ब्रिटिश एक्चुअली the British land revenue policy involved the Rayatwari, the Mahalwari and the permanent settlement system, and in the pre-British era there was no such system. मैं आपसे क्वेश्चन ये नहीं पूछ रहा हूं दैट आई एम जस्ट सेइंग टू व्हाट एक्सटेंट द ब्रिटिश लैंड रेवेन्यू पॉलिसीज डिफर्ड फ्रॉम द प्री ब्रिटिश काउंटर पार्ट. ये क्वेश्चन ये नहीं है कि आप चालू हो गए कि आपको जितना पता है आप बस लिख देना है क्योंकि लैंड रेवेन्यू पे है, मैंने पढ़ा है. आई एम आस्किंग यू द क्वेश्चन इज कैन बी मोर नुआंस्ड अबाउट नेचर ऑफ द पॉलिसी, नॉट अबाउट फीचर ऑफ द पॉलिसी. आप जो बोलेंगे वो होगा फीचर. फीचर का नेचर क्या है, राइट? सो फीचर्स ऑफ द ब्रिटिश लैंड रेवेन्यू पॉलिसी, what is the nature? First let's understand, then you'll find out the difference yourself, you'll understand it. Okay, and then prelims में क्या आ सकता है, the different types of the land revenue policies, and that are रायतवाड़ी, permanent settlement, all these systems. Okay, now to understand firstly you should first know something about the British land revenue policy. अभी मैं जो बताऊंगा उसको शांति से सुनिएगा पहले, क्योंकि आपने इकोनॉमी नहीं पढ़ा है और वैसे आप ये इकोनॉमी कभी पढ़ेंगे भी नहीं, क्योंकि दैट इज नॉट रेलेवेंट फ्रॉम योर कोर्स पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू ऑल्सो. बट ये इकोनॉमिक फिलॉसफी भी एक सब्जेक्ट है. जैसे एक होता है इंडिविजुअल फिलॉसफी, मैं क्यों हूँ, जीवन क्या है, खुशी क्या है, गम क्या है. एक होता है पॉलिटिकल फिलॉसफी जो शुभ्रा मैम पढ़ाती हैं, व्हाट इज स्टेट, व्हाई डिड स्टेट कम इनटू एग्जिस्टेंस, व्हाट इज द पर्पस ऑफ स्टेट, है ना. एक ऐसी होती है इकोनॉमिक फिलॉसफी, व्हाट इज मनी, है ना, ऑल ऑफ दिस. So there is a part of economic philosophy here also, that firstly when you see any economy, and let's start with the British land revenue policy itself. See, the British actually, just like Indian economy was predominantly agrarian in pre-British era and British era, so British also are depending upon land revenue to generate a significant amount of revenue from the region. Now it is this land revenue that there are similarities also and differences also. Firstly, the British, actually there is some similarity and some difference. Okay, but to understand that, firstly one should understand what is the British land revenue system, nature of the British land revenue system. The British firstly said we need to achieve one objective, ultimate objective is what? To increase land revenue. क्योंकि अल्टीमेट ऑब्जेक्टिव इज पैसा एंड मोर पैसा, राइट. सो इंक्रीज लैंड रेवेन्यू, इसके लिए व्हाट डू वी नीड टू डू इज वी नीड अ रीथिंक, वी नीड टू मूव अवे फ्रॉम द प्री ब्रिटिश systems in the region, and we need to firstly incentivize the producer. अगर प्रोड्यूसर को इंसेंटिव दिया जाए that you produce more, then producer will also earn more, and if producer will earn more, then tax will automatically increase. Then they said that we need to incentivize the producer because that will increase the collection of the land revenue. And how do we incentivize this producer? How do we incentivize the producer? For this, the producer must be given a few things. कैसे आपको ये जीवन में आपके कब कैसे इंसेंटिव आएगा कि आप खूब पैसा कमाएं? अरे टैक्स रिबेट, इकोनॉमिक फिलॉसफी की बात हो रही है, फिलॉसफी, टैक्स रिबेट तो टेक्निकलिटी आ गई, हम फिलॉसफी की बात. आपके जीवन में यू विल फर्स्टली प्रोड्यूस मोर and will be interested in producing more when you can pass off the wealth to your next generation. अगर ये हो जाए that you cannot inherit property or you cannot inherit land, then तो आपने जो कमाया है वो आपको उड़ा के जाना है. अगर if Mark Zuckerberg is told tomorrow or Steve Jobs was told you have $1 trillion before you die of cancer, burn. Because anyways, if you die, your wealth is nationalized by the state. देखिए, so in the pre-British counterpart, there was no right to land or right to inherit land. There was no right to property in land. जो आप एक शब्द, आप अभी पॉलिटी आपने चालू नहीं हुआ है ना, so आप जैसे अभी पॉलिटी में भी नहीं पढ़ेंगे कि right to property तो आप पढ़ेंगे पॉलिटी में, इन लैंड ये भी पढ़ेंगे, लेकिन ये नहीं पढ़ेंगे कि व्हाट इज प्रॉपर्टी, राइट तो आप पढ़ेंगे, राइट इज समथिंग विच इज इन्फोर्स बाय लॉ, दैट if this is my land, you try to forcibly acquire it, I can go to the court and the court will ensure that my right is respected by other citizens also and the state also. ऐसा नहीं कि भारत सरकार ने आया बोला कि यहाँ मेट्रो बनेगी और यहाँ कुछ भी होगा तो दे दो अपनी जमीन. It is my land. If the state also wants to take, it will have to pay some compensation, something, right? So that is a right is legally enforceable. Okay, and judicial remedies are available for ensuring that rights do not get compromised. But what is property? What is property? Can this duster be my property? Can this pen be my property? So what is property? Something earned by labor. Anything else?
Philosophically, if we think some things which motivates you to earn more property.
Something that motivates you to earn more property. Whatever you own. Anything else? Which has some value. Yes, you're going there, getting there. Which has some value. But what value? Material value. Monetary value. देखिए, anything becomes a property when it has some monetary value. But अब बोले इसमें क्या है सर इनसाइड फालतू में, अभी बता रहा हूँ इनसाइड आ रहा है. That this monetary value of anything is determined by what? By its features, by its utility. Utility, if it was to determine the cost of anything, then many things in this world would not have had that higher price. Demand. Exactly. The economic value of any good is determined by two factors, demand and supply. But even demand and supply se pehle, so firstly you need a market for any good. Then only property makes sense. I say this is my property, but there is no demand for this in the market, or there is no market for this good. Then this is no longer actually, क्या करोगे इस property का? Suppose I have this duster, I say that this is duster, आप बोले we don't want it, we don't need it, we don't use it. So is this something which has a market? No. अगर कोई बोलता है कि ये क्या है, मैं बोलूं एक पत्थर उठा के that this is something that is my property. आप बोलेंगे इसका मैं क्या करूं? If it has no intrinsic value, it has no market value. If there is no demand in the market for this, I may keep it, inherit it, whatever I may do. This does not have any, it does not have any economic value. Why? Because the market does not have any demand and supply for it. And this is what is important, because the value of any commodity is partly being determined by the demand and supply of that good. But at a fundamental level, even below this, lies something more interesting that I'll come to in a minute. Okay. So right to property in land, meaning land in the pre-British time, land could never be bought and sold in the market. There was no market in land. Why? Because all the land belonged to the king or the state. And since all the land belonged to the king, there was no question of a property in land. Okay? There was no funda of a property in land because land itself did not have a market. तो प्रॉपर्टी तभी बन सकती है कोई चीज जब उसके लिए कोई मार्केट हो. अगर उसका कोई मार्केट ही नहीं है, then there can be no property at a fundamental level. It is only when there will be a market in land, it makes sense to have a right to property in land. Do you hear that there is a market in free air? There is. India also air filter. Okay. So what becomes a commodity or not, and that is what is also linked to this. This is also called as the commodification of land happened under the British. That something that is bought and sold in the market, that becomes a commodity. Okay, when something which was not a commodity before but becomes a commodity today is what is the process by which something becomes a commodity when it was not previously is commodification. जब भी ये suffix लग जाए fication or ization, that is something that refers to a process. They ask the question in your mains examination in GS paper 1 and that asks you what is secularism and secularization. Okay, so जब भी ization लग जाए, it refers to a process. So the process by which something which was not a commodity before is converted into a commodity today is called as commodification. And this is what happens in British. The British introduced a market in land where there would be buyers and sellers, where there would be the right to inheritance of land as a property. All of this is something which is introduced by the British. British are introducing a completely new system. Real estate ka janam British se hua by and large in India. There is no blanket thing, it is by and large. Okay, that before the British came into India, there were no buyers and sellers in land. There was no inheritance of land as a property. Because there was no idea of a market in land, there was no idea of property in land because land all belonged to the king. Land was not a commodity before the British. ऐसी कोई commodity, ऐसी कोई चीज है जो आज commodity है लेकिन पहले नहीं थी? Right to property in land. Property किसी भी चीज की हो सकती है. Property can be gold. There can be gold is something which is your property. You have passed it on from one generation to other. But I'm saying property in land. There was no right to property in land. Right to property was there. You had cattle. Cattle was passed on. Wealth from one generation to another. Household wealth, gold, pieces of art, anything could be a land. देखिए ultimately as I'm saying, अभी आप रुकिए, अभी आप आएंगे कस्टमरी प्रॉपर्टी राइट्स, एक लीगल प्रॉपर्टी, शांत सब होगा, पहले आप धीमा तो समझिए. सो इज देयर एनीथिंग व्हिच वाज, सो currently can you think of any example something that was a commodity, was not a commodity before but is a commodity today? Water, air, clean air is becoming soon and soon a commodity, right? So you earlier drinking water, पुण्य पिलाने, पानी पिलाना पुण्य का काम था, अब पैसे का भी है, right? और air also, right? But can you think of something which was a commodity before but is not a commodity today? No? Owning slaves. Was slaves or slavery was a practice which said that humans are a commodity, they can be bought and sold in the market. But then with the abolition of slavery, it is no longer a commodity. Right? So commodification is not something which is inevitable or only a unidirectional. It can go both ways. There can be commodification and there can be decommodification also. What is there? Right? So this is to give you that context. Now I am saying कि sir right to property in land. अभी हम ये जो बातें कर रहे हैं, this is about legal rights. There is also something which is customary right. वो मैं बाद में आऊँगा. Okay. अभी आप रुक जाइए वो कि सर इसके पहले क्या मतलब कभी लैंड इनहेरिट ही नहीं होती थी. लीगली कोई इनहेरिटेंस नहीं था. लीगल का मतलब क्या है? That if the king took away your piece of land, you were living on that piece of land for generations. The king one day came and took away your piece of land. You could not go to the court and say the king, how can king take away my land? There is no legal property. इसीलिए मैं बार-बार legal right to property, right? Judicially enforceable. Customary rights का क्या significance है? I'll come to later. अभी छोड़ दीजिए उसे. So what are the British introducing? ये सब. The British are introducing commodification of land. The British are introducing inheritance rights in land. The British are introducing a market in land. All with the intention of doing what? that it is to incentivize the producer. पर कैसे sir? Ultimately, it will incentivize the producer how? That you are a good producer. You are taking interest in increasing produce. So you don't need to worry. You can always buy more land from the market. And why should you buy more land from the market? Because don't worry, even when you die, this land will be passed on to the next generation. It is not like जागीरदारी कि किंग ने हटा दिया, आपकी next generation को नहीं मिली वो land. You will own the land. It will be passed on to the next generation. You can buy as much as you want. This is the birth of what? In a way, capitalism. In agricultural, this is agricultural capitalism in a way. Basically, you are saying कि आपकी मर्जी है, आपको जितना agriculture करना है, खरीदो land करो. Right? And the more you produce, the more you keep, and the more even we will get. They said, लेकिन एक और problem है. ये जो pre-British सब थे, इन्होंने बहुत ही बुरा, they've set a very bad precedent. If produce was more, they increased tax rates. If produce was less, they decreased tax rates. So if produce was more, they said अभी तो अच्छी produce हुआ है, इस बार तो higher tax ले लो, क्या पता अगली बार there is a drought or a famine or a flood because of which produce is less. If you try to collect 40% tax when the farmer is producing mainly goods of 1 lakh rupees, then it is going to make it very difficult for the farmer to pay a high rate of tax when the produce is low, right? Because it will leave with him very little for his own survival. But if you have 10 lakh produce, then at least it is possible for him to pay. The kings knew that if they impose high burden of taxes in low produce years, it would lead to peasant revolts. So they often did not impose high burden of taxes in low produce years. But the years in which produce was good, they imposed high burden of taxes. So was the tax system stable or unstable? Unstable. And we say to incentivize people to produce more, you need a stable taxation system. Why? बड़ा practical example है, आपकी salary है 8 lakh. Suppose your salary is 8 lakh rupees, you are in the 20% income tax bracket. And the government tomorrow increases the tax rate to 30%. Okay? So even at the same income, even at the same salary, your income will drop or not? Yes. And आपने बोला नहीं नहीं मेहनत करते हैं, सैलरी बढ़ जाएगी, 10 लाख हो गई सैलरी, ठीक है जी. All of a sudden, the government introduced a new slab rate for above 10% and says that you have to pay 40% tax. Then the net income actually would be almost either same or less. So in a stable taxation, in an unstable taxation system, people will say क्यों ही produce करें, जब ज़्यादा produce करेंगे तो king will take it away. Surplus produce, king anyways will take away. High produce years, more produce will be taken. Low produce years, less will be taken. हमारी तो जीवन में कोई फर्क आना नहीं है. Why should we put in the effort? So a stable taxation system incentivizes people to produce more. Having legal property rights in land which were judicially enforceable, having a land market which was there, and having a land market and commodification of land all incentivize people to take initiative to try and increase productivity and produce more and increase their own income and increase the land revenue generation for the British. Now where did this all motivation for this come from? British landlord system. In British, landlordism system was introduced, and in Britain there was the landlord system. Basically the landlords owned a large amount of land and they got cheap labor from the market, and with that cheap labor they produced goods and they could inherit the land and the wealth generated from it to the next generation, and this had worked in Britain. So उन्होंने बोला कि ये यहाँ भी काम कर जाएगा. We can incentivize the producers even here, provide them a more stable regime as compared to the pre-British counterparts that will incentivize them to produce more. Any doubts still here? ये कोई कहानी की शुरुआत है, लेकिन इसको आप लिख लीजिए पहले. So because these are characteristics of British land revenue system, यहाँ पे हमने रायतवारी, परमानेंट सेटलमेंट, जमीन, उन सब की बात नहीं कर रहे हैं, वो बाद में आएगा. They are the types. Okay, these are the features. Okay, so these are the features or characteristics. Okay, or nature. So basically, you write firstly. Yeah, the British land revenue policies and their impact. This is the second topic. The British land revenue policies and their impact. Write down, the British introduced a new property rights system in land. Introduce a new property right system or a new legal property right system. Introduced a new legal property right system in land with the objective of A. Incentivizing producers to take initiative. Incentivizing producers to take initiative to produce more, and B, point number B, this was point A, point B, and thereby increase agricultural productivity and revenue collection for the British state. Right? And revenue collection for the British state in the region. Now, the next para. Okay. The nature of the British land revenue policies was in sharp contrast. The nature of the British land revenue policies was in sharp contrast to that of its pre-British counterparts. The nature of British policies was in sharp contrast to that of the pre-British counterparts as A. The British introduced a judicially enforceable or legally enforceable, one and the same thing. The British introduced a judicially or a legally enforceable property rights system property rights system in land. System in land. This was in sharp contrast. This was in sharp contrast to the pre-British system under which peasants only enjoyed customary rights in land. Customary rights क्या होते थे? Very simple, that देखिए there was no property, there was no market in land. Land was not a property. All the land belonged to the king. So why there was no need to ever displace a peasant. The king would demand a portion of the produce as a revenue. There was no option for the peasant to deny it to the king. Okay, so the peasants could not deny to the king. Only when the burden of tax was often high, the peasants would revolt. Okay, and if peasants would revolt, तो उनको मार के, thrash them up and put them in order. But it's not that they were displaced from the piece of land. Why? Because the peasant is the cultivator. If you will displace them from the piece of land, where will you get another producer from? And it is not that the peasant is willfully not paying the tax. It is because either the produce is less or the burden of tax is too high. So even one peasant group was replaced by another, it would still lead to peasant revolt. So historically peasants were not displaced because it could even trigger wider revolts. But it did not mean that the isolated peasants or a few group of peasants could not be removed. But by virtue of tradition and custom for generations, often peasants kept on cultivating the same piece of land. Who were transferred were not the peasants but the Jagirdars. The Jagirdars were transferred because they were the ones who could do corruption. Peasant क्या करेगा corruption? देखिए क्या है, हमारे यहाँ देश में एक बड़ी अच्छा फेसबुक चलता है. Every individual can be agent of change, है ना? आप, if you stop giving bribes, corruption will disappear. ऐसा ज्ञान फेसबुक पे ही मिलता है. Why? Just to give you two contexts, that there are two different types of corruption. One is coercive corruption, कि आप मुझे नहीं देंगे 100 रुपए तो मैं पासपोर्ट नहीं दूंगा. Where I am indulging in corruption to deny a delivery of service to you, which you are legally entitled to. You come to me, I am the passport officer. आपको जाना है US, आपने वीजा बनने, आपने पासपोर्ट बनने के लिए दिया है. I say no, unless you give me 1,000 rupees, I will not sign. That is coercive corruption. एक और corruption होता है collusive corruption, where you come to me, you are the road contractor, you say, सर जी मेरे को दे देना contract, 10% आपका, 90% मेरा. So both are partners in crime. Here in a coercive corruption there is adversary relationship between the bribe taker and the bribe giver. If you don't give bribe, you may be denied your passport. But collusive corruption, both are partners in crime where both stand to gain from corruption. But who loses then? The public. Okay, so corruption will not disappear if you stop giving bribes, because the bribes that you give is only for coercive corruption. The bigger challenge today is collusive corruption. तो अगली बार जब आपको कोई ज्ञान दे ऐसा, तो आप ये ज्ञान देना उसको. Right? So it will not disappear like this. Okay? So why am I telling you this is that there was a clear chance of collusion. There could always be collusions between jagirdars, governors, something or the other. Both would split revenue. बोल देंगे revenue बढ़ा ही नहीं. कुछ भी हो सकता है, लेकिन definitely the peasant is not stealing the revenue. So peasants were never often displaced. It were the jagirdars who were transferred from one region to other to keep a check on them. तभी तो IAS officers का transfer होता है. इसीलिए वो उसके अलग, there are many other reasons also for this. For short tenure of civil servants, often in in the positions as a district magistrate, but there is also, if there can be instances of collusive corruption as well, right? So it is for you to remember that when I say that customary property rights in land existed in pre-British India, it means that by virtue of tradition and custom, not because of any legal force, they are not being displaced. Okay, it is only primarily because of custom. Who gets often displaced is the jagirdar. Write the next point. देखिए अभी जो मैंने आपको बात बताई कोल्यूसिव एंड कोअर्सिव करप्शन, आपको लग रहा होगा कि सर ये कहाँ आप कुछ भी करते रहते हैं, राइट? दिस इज द सेकंड ARC रिपोर्ट्स डेफिनेशन ऑन करप्शन. तो ऐसा नहीं है कि आपके दिमाग में मैं कचरा भर रहा हूँ, वो आपको बाद में समझ में आएगा मैं क्या कर रहा हूँ. Okay, so there is a lot of information that is to be put in. Partly थोड़ा सा आपका दिमाग हल्का हो जाता है. Secondly जो आपके एग्जाम में भी आगे यूज आएगा. Okay, so that is there. Now right, yeah.
Can we write that by virtue of tradition and custom, one can inherit the land?
हाँ, so one had customary property rights in land. बस, it is not legal property rights in land. Any other doubts still here? Okay, so right. So the British introduced the judicially enforceable property right system. This was in sharp contrast to the British system, right? So point number B, the British introduced a functional market. The British introduced a functional market in land by converting it into a commodity. By converting it into a commodity which could be openly bought and sold, which could be openly bought and sold in which could be openly bought and sold in the market, which could be openly bought and sold in the market. Okay, that is there. That's point number C. Or sorry, in point number B, just add one more line. This is in contrast. This is in contrast to pre-British. This is in contrast to pre-British era, where there was no commodification of land. Point number C. The British introduced a stable revenue collection system the British introduced a stable revenue collection system where the land revenue rates were relatively fixed. Where the land revenue rates were relatively fixed. Is that point clear? This is in contrast, or this was in contrast to pre-British systems where princely rulers often imposed high revenue rates during years of high produce, and low rates in low produce and lower rates in low produce years. And point number C. Point number D. The British, and this is the last point for today, so don't get restless. The British introduced salaried revenue collecting officials which vastly increased the efficiency of tax collection. This was in contrast to pre-British systems. This was in contrast to pre-British systems like Jagirdari. This was in contrast to pre-British systems like Jagirdari, Saranjami, like Jagirdari and Saranjami systems, where a major portion of produce was cornered by Jagirdars. Right? Meaning it is a relatively more efficient revenue collection system than many other older systems. Khalisa system had salaried revenue collection system, or under Mysore also there is a salaried revenue collection system. So that is why we are saying not all previous revenue collection systems were inefficient, but most of them were. Is that much clear? Difference, we are saying कि the British revenue collection system is more efficient than most of the pre-British revenue collection system. Khalisa से कोई बहुत ज़्यादा difference नहीं है. Both Khalisa is also relatively more efficient. हाँ, तो यहाँ भी वही है. British also introduced salary revenue collecting officials. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.